All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I'm going through a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main textbook for our class is ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor. And as I've mentioned before on previous lectures, it's a very good book in that it's very code intensive, but it's not a very good book because they don't have a lot of comments that explain that code. So what I've decided to do is to go over another book first, that book being Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway and others from Microsoft. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through Chapter 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up that chapter in just a couple seconds. All right, without trying to bore you too much, I do most of these lectures from inside of a classroom. All right, the acoustics are typically better in there, and it's more like home, for lack of better words. All right, but there is a class that comes in at 8:05 a.m. and they've started filing in before 7:30. So I decided to move back into our offices. So if that's why I had to pause for just a moment. And if it sounds a little funky, that's the reason why. So I am at the middle of page 63. All right. This section, as mentioned, covers the Razor view engine, including Razor syntax, layouts, partial views, etc. Now, the Razor view engine is not new. As it says, it was introduced in ASP.NET MVC 3. It's the default view engine from now on. All right. So this chapter is focusing on Razor. Razor, as it says, is the response to one of the most requested suggestions received by the ASP.NET feature team to provide a view engine, all right, where a user, for lack of better words, would be able to, inside of their view, so inside of their HTML, to add or embed C# on an as-needed basis. As mentioned on the bottom of page 63, going on to page 64 here, the author says, Razor provides a streamlined syntax for expressing views and minimizes the amount of syntax and extra characters. It effectively gets out of your way and puts as little syntax between you and your markup as possible. All right. Razor accomplishes this by understanding the structure of markup so that it can make transitions between code and markup. So the code is the C#, the markup is the HTML. So if you look right here, here's an example of Razor syntax. This is a block of Razor code. Notice there's even a comment in here, and we're creating an array called items, which holds 1, 2, and 3, those 3 strings. Then we break out, once we hit the curly brace, we've got some HTML. Then we go back into Razor by starting with that @ sign. Here again, we need the curly braces here and here because there's more than one line. So this goes back again into C# code, which is going to allow us to go through that. So that should print on the screen 1, 2, 3 on 3 different lines. So as it says here on page 64, the previous code sample uses C# syntax, which means the file must have a .cs HTML file extension. Razor views that use VB are .vb HTML. We don't touch on those at all. All right. The author says here, near the bottom of page 64, don't overthink this stuff. Razor was designed to be easy and intuitive. For the most part, you don't have to worry about the syntax. If you're completely new to ASP.NET MVC, skimming the rest of the chapter, coming back to it later. Yeah, that's fine. All right. The key transition character, or the character that makes this go in Razor, is the @ sign. It transitions, it says, hey, I'm not in HTML markup mode anymore. I'm going into C# mode. The two basic types of doing this are code expressions and code blocks. Expressions are evaluated and written to the response. An example is right here. So that's embedding it right inside of HTML, which is totally legit. Since we're embedding it inside, we don't have it inside of curly braces. And they give you a bunch of different ways of doing this. All right. Halfway down on page 65, the ability for Razor to automatically transition back from code to markup is one of its biggest appeals. All right. It helps keep the syntax compact and clean. And again, they go through a bunch of examples on 65 and 66. I'm not going to go over those. On the bottom of page 66 and going on to the next page or two, HTML encoding. It says here, given that many cases exist where a view is used to display user input, such as a blog post, the potential exists somebody could try to do things they're not supposed to do. All right? They talk about cross-site script injection attacks, also known as XSS, which will be discussed in Chapter 7, and I believe that's when we talk about authentication and authorization, security, etc. Razor expressions are automatically HTML encoded. So if you try to put this in, what would happen is it would take that script tag and turn it into something like this, an &LT script and &GT. So it would convert this actual JavaScript tag into its HTML entity right there. Now, if you've got cases where you intend to show the markup, as it says, you can return an instance of system.web.ihtml string and Razor will not encode it. So if you want to show your actual HTML tags. And as it says, this automatic encoding that you get right here, all right, what's nice about this encoding that you get is the fact that it should help mitigate the number of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that you go through. So it should make your stuff cleaner by default, and there's not really anything extra you have to do in order to be able to use it. We'll get into this in more depth and breadth of coverage when we get to Chapter 7, and as the author says right here, understanding security implications is very important. You know, you've got to really, as a developer, you've got to go into this with the mindset that virtually every user that tries to use your site, in essence, could be somebody trying to do harm. Not that they are, they could be. All right, so you want to mitigate that from happening as much as you possibly can. All right, so we talked about code blocks a little bit, and they're within curly braces. All right, so as it says, what's interesting about this is, yeah, this is C#, but notice we're dropping HTML right inside of it. All right, so the system knows that when you're doing that, how to transition in and how to transition out. Okay. Now they mention, it says, oh, somewhere in here, this is near the bottom of page 68. It says, note that curly braces are not required for block statements. All right, because Razor has a special allowance. That said, I'd use them anyway. Why? Because that's the way most people do it. All right. Sometimes that's really, for lack of better words, a crummy answer. All right. I always remember, I like to, at least on occasion, give non-computer examples. But I remember years and years and years ago, all right, my wife and I have 3 daughters, and all 3 of our kids are adopted. We brought my daughter home from Colombia, South America, when she was, my daughter Mackenzie, my middle daughter, and we brought her home when she was about 9 months old. All right, she was very advanced. She was a very bright little kid. But I remember it wasn't too long. She was walking. Maybe she was a year. I don't remember. But when she walked, I remember one day my wife had gone to the store and I was watching Mackenzie, and she kept walking up toward the stove. Well, my wife had something on the stove, so it was hot. And I would say, no, 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 no. And she would look at me like, what? And it was like, don't touch that. And I'd move her away. I kept doing it and doing it. I must have done it a half dozen times. Then one time I was too late. She touched the stove. She burnt her hand. She started crying. All right. What does this have to do with anything? Well, there is typically a way of doing things. And you can circumvent that way of doing things, but it may have consequences. The consequences for Razor is if you don't put the curly braces in there, it can make it harder for you or others who look at your code to understand what it is you're trying to do. All right? All right. Some Razor examples or samples, which is most of the rest of the chapter, starting on the bottom of page 68. First, we have implicit code expression, where it says code expressions are evaluated and written to the response. This is typically how you display a value in a view. We already looked at that. Code expressions in Razor are always HTML encoded. We talked about that. Then we've got explicit code expressions. Then we have unencoded code expressions when you do the raw, when you're telling it to render something and you should not render the HTML code. We've got code blocks that we've looked at already. We've got the way that you can combine code and markup. Mixing code and plain text. As the author says, Razor looks for the beginning of a tag to determine when to transition from code to markup and back again or whatever. And there are some examples of doing this on the bottom of the page here. Escaping the code delimiter on the top of page 70. If you need to display an @ sign, if you literally need to display the @ sign, you can put @ sign, @ sign. So for instance, remember that @ sign, it can be used, I don't know, with certain HTML entities or whatever. Comments, anything you put that's inside of @ sign star and ends with a star @ sign, that's all a comment. Calling a generic method, middle of page 70. As it says here, calling a generic method is no different from calling an explicit code expression. I appreciate the author going through this. Do I think it's a good idea? Yes. But I would add to that, I don't know if it's a good idea right now. We haven't done enough work with Razor that I don't think much of this is going to resonate with you. But I think as we go on and look at more and more, hopefully at least, it'll make more and more sense to you. All right? So, layouts in Razor help maintain a consistent look and feel across multiple views in the application. That's typically what you're going to want. So as a user iterates their way from page to page, you typically want a common look and feel. The only time that you may deviate from that is if the user does something wrong or somehow they get pushed to an error page. You might want that error page to look differently, as an example. And again, they give some examples of layouts. I'm not going to run through these. on the bottom of page 72, the bottom half. First, the author talks here about default layout changes in MVC5. As it says here, when you create a new MVC5 application using the internet or intranet template, you get a default layout with some basic style applied using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is becoming more and more a player in ASP.NET because it's a way of you being able to fairly seamlessly provide complex CSS into a website. All right. View start, bottom of page 72 and going on to page 73. In the preceding examples, each view specified in its layout page was specified using a layout property. For a group of views that use the same layout, this can get redundant. So rather than you having to create your own view, if these views are going to be shared, then you can go into and look at the viewstart.cshtml file, which says go to the views folder. Under the views folder, go to the shared folder, and under that, run the layout.cshtml. All right, you can still override this if you want to, but if you look back at our code here, you'll notice that under views, not even sure if we have one, but let's look here. Let's go under app start. Let's see. When you create a default project, underscore view start, there it is. And that's saying, go use this by default. You can still take any view and override this. But if you don't, it'll use this layout page by default. So what is that? View shared layout CSHTML. That's just any default stuff that you have for the system. All right. So there's the layout. So it's all this. Look familiar? Home page, home index, contact, etc. My ASP, application, all that. So this would be the footer. So you'll notice if we say this, we'll change this from my ASP.NET application to MVC Music Store application. We'll save this. We'll run the program. We'll go down to the bottom of any page, and we'll look at our footer, and you will notice, or you should notice, that it has changed. So that it now says, hit the wrong button there. Where are we? There we go. If we go down to the bottom, notice MVC Music Store application. All right. And that'll be at the bottom of any page. So the About page, there it is. The Contact page, there it is. All right, the last thing that's discussed in this chapter, are partial views. Bottom half of page 73 and page 74. In addition to returning a view, an action method can also return a partial view. Here is an example. So notice return partial view. In this case, the view named message.cshtml is rendered. However, if the layout is specified here and not within the view, the layout is not rendered. All right. A partial view looks a lot more like a normal view, but it doesn't specify a layout. It says this is particularly useful in scenarios that involve AJAX. Now, AJAX will be Chapter 8, but to just give it to you very quickly, AJAX is an acronym that stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It allows you to do partial page refreshes. Used to be in the olden days, like in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when you were working on a website and you had to update part of a page, the whole page updated. And for a second, you got what was called flicker, as boom, you went from one page and it redrew itself. Now with Ajax, it can only redraw or only has to redraw what needs to be redrawn. All right. Says here if we want to see stuff, with that, we can go to the package manager and install yet another package. So let's copy that. Let's go down again to our code. Let's go to the package manager, which we may have to drag up to see it. Should be here still. Well, just in case, we can always go to View, Other Windows, find our package manager console. There it is. And I can paste this in. Install package rocks Pro MVC5 views, specifying views, and now it's putting that in. All right, what did that do? Well, let's take a quick look and see what it did. So I'm going to stop the previous run here, and I'm going to go back to my code, and I should have a folder there now. And that new folder that I have, we'll find it, is called Specifying Views. It's under Samples, and there it is, samplecontroller.cs. All right. So if I come up and I run the program again, we're almost finished with this particular chapter. So if I come in and I run the program again, and I iterate over, as you'll see in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to iterate over to /sample/index. Okay, we've got that. Look at, there's another, it looks pretty much like what we did before, but as it says, it's a sample view, and then we can go to index 2. All right. And we can go to index 3. All right. Sure exactly what that one was doing. And finally, we can go over to partial view demo. All right. Didn't like that because I didn't write demo. I wrote dimp. There it is. And there's a partial view. All right. Not a whole lot in that last page, couple pages, but that's fine. All right, let's finish up this chapter. And as the author says here in the summary, that is on the bottom of page 74, view engines have a specified constrained purpose. They exist to take data passed to them from the controller and generate formatted output, normally in the form of hypertext markup language. All right. As the developer, you are empowered to achieve the goals of your view in any way that makes you happy. So in other words, you can always do a lot of overwrite or any overwrite. We looked at the Razor view, and it says its terse and simple syntax allows you to make writing rich and secure pages easy. And easy is a relative term, but easier than they would be otherwise, okay? When I come back, which will be tomorrow morning, I'm going to go over Chapter 4, which is on models. And if there's time, Chapter 5, which is on HTML forms and HTML helpers, all right? So I'll be back with that lecture or those lectures at that time.